German Field Marshal von Kleist hailed it as the best tank of World War II. Panzer Leader General Heinz Guderian, upon encountering the Red Army's T-34 for the first time, declared that the tank possessed vast superiority over German tanks. The Soviets wove legendary tales around its incredible performance on the battlefields of Eastern Europe. But what made the T-34 the best tank of World War II exactly? Design on the TFE commenced late in 1930, when the Red Army was primarily equipped with T-26 or Bystrykhodny light tanks, known for their speed and agility, but severely lacking in protection and firepower. These tanks saw action during the Spanish Civil War, where Soviet forces supported Spanish communists, and during the Soviet Union's undeclared border war with Japan. During the 1988 to 1939 border skirmishes with Japan, the Red Army's tanks were decisively defeated by the less powerful, yet superior Japanese Type 95 tanks. Infantrymen inflicted numerous casualties on Soviet tanks by launching Molotov cocktails, which turned the tanks into massive fireballs as flaming gasoline seeped through poorly welded armor and into the engine compartment. The Soviet Union urgently needed a replacement tank for its ground forces, and it needed one quickly. Although Hitler had established a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, the Red Army's poor performance against both Japan and Finland in the Winter War sent a strong signal of weakness. Stalin feared nothing more than Hitler unleashing his forces upon him. The first prototypes of the T-34 entered production in 1939, featuring a coil spring Christie suspension similar to the previous BT series of tanks, enabling them to achieve higher speeds than other tanks in service globally. The innovative track design also gave the entire tank an incredibly low ground pressure of 0.64 km/h, slightly exceeding the pressure an average human footprint exerts on the ground. This meant that the T-34 was exceptionally maneuverable and less likely to become bogged down in snow and thick mud, environments familiar to those living on Russia's western steppes. The gasoline engine, highly vulnerable to Molotov attacks, was replaced with a diesel engine, providing enough horsepower to propel the T-34 at speeds of up to 35 mph, 56 kW. This made the T-34 10 miles an hour faster than the German Panzer III or Panzer IV. The T-34 also featured a revolutionary sloped armor design measuring 45 mm thick. The 60-degree angle of the armor effectively meant that any incoming round had to penetrate an extra 5 mm of armor, enhancing protection without adding excess weight. The slope also ensured that most incoming projectiles on a horizontal trajectory would harmlessly ricochet off the armor. The main gun was a significant upgrade over previous Soviet designs, featuring a 76 mm cannon with a muzzle velocity of around 2,000 mph, 600 mph, enabling the T-34 to destroy any other tank in the world, even at long ranges. With great fanfare surrounding the T-34's production, designer Mikhail Koshkin completed 2 prototypes in January of 1940 and decided to subject them to an extremely demanding trial by fire. He personally drove both tanks from Ukraine to Moscow, a journey of about 745 miles, 1,200 kilometers, then to the border with Finland, onward to Kiev, and finally back to the factory in Kharkov. The incredible endurance test demonstrated the tank's durability and structural soundness. Only minor modifications were required to the suspension and drivetrain before full-scale production commenced. However, Koshkin contracted pneumonia during the journey and succumbed, replaced as head of the T-34 program by his deputy, Alexander Morozov. With a spectacular endurance trial under its belt, full-scale production of the T-34 began in September of 1941 at the Kharkov Comintern locomotive plant, with concurrent production starting 6 months later at the Stalingrad tractor factory. The tank would see 4 distinct versions, all equipped with the powerful 76 mm gun. The first version of the T-34 was formally recognized by the Red Army as the Model 1940. Despite Soviet engineering rapidly catching up with the rest of the world, its manufacturing still lacked the raw skill and expertise needed to build modern tanks. Instead of the more powerful and safer V12 diesel engine, many early T-34s were fitted with MT-17 gasoline engines due to difficulties in manufacturing the V12s. The initial L-11 76 mm gun was quickly found to have poor penetration capability against armored targets and was hastily replaced with the F-34 76mm gun. With an improved muzzle velocity of 2130 ft/s, 650 barniers de memorance, the new cannon proved highly effective at punching through German armor. The new model of T-34 was designated as the Model 1941, entering service in the summer of 1941. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, his planned offensive to defeat the communist government of the Soviet Union. With over 3 million soldiers, 150 divisions, and 3,000 tanks forming 3 army groups, the German advance created an initial front spanning over 1,800 miles. Initially, the Germans achieved victory after victory, pushing the Soviet forces back. However, a few months after the offensive began, the Red Army started receiving the T-34 in force, shocking the Germans with the mighty new tanks leading Soviet counterattacks. German Panzer IIIs discovered that their 50mm gun was virtually useless against the sloped frontal armor of the T-34, as was the 50mm PaK-38 anti-tank gun used by support units. German tank commanders realized that their only hope of stopping the T-34 was to outmaneuver it. No easy feat given the T-34's agility and effectiveness in the muddy and snowy conditions of Western Russia, while heavy German panzers tended to get bogged down. Nonetheless, superior German training meant Soviet forces were outmaneuvered repeatedly, and the T-34 suffered heavy casualties. Despite their inferior training and communications, T-34s managed to halt the German advance into the Soviet Union. For all its strengths, the T-34 had some serious drawbacks. First was the poor Soviet workmanship. The T-34 was largely built by an inexperienced workforce with limited expertise. The need to expedite tank production resulted in shortcuts, and while the T-34 was one of the best designed tanks of World War II, the poor workmanship often hampered its performance in reality. Mechanical failures experienced by the tank were often the result of rushed labor, rather than fundamental design flaws. The T-34 also had a 2-man manually traversed turret, requiring the commander to double as the gunner. This placed a heavy workload on the tank commander, diverting valuable time from his most crucial task, commanding the tank. For platoon leaders, maintaining command and control over an entire platoon, not just their own tank, became virtually impossible. This was a significant factor contributing to the poor performance of Soviet tank forces against the Germans. The turret also lacked a basket or raised floor that moved with the turret, meaning tank crews were constantly at risk of tripping over spent shells as the turret rotated. Visibility was a major problem for T-34 tank commanders, as the tank lacked the Cupola and Periscope standard among Allied tanks. This problem was rectified in the T-34 model 1943, but until then, tank commanders often entered battle with the main hatch open, ducking behind it as they struggled to assess the battlefield. Needless to say, entering battle with the main hatch open was a very bad idea, but better than fighting blind. The armor of the T-34 was extremely rigid and offered no give when struck. This meant that the force of an impacting round might not penetrate the thick armor, but could still generate lethal steel splinters inside the tank, killing or seriously injuring crew members. The steep slope of the armor also made the T-34 a cramped machine. When U.S. Army engineers tested a T-34 in 1942, they were amazed that the Soviets could fit 4 fully equipped crewmen inside. The cramped space also meant that the sides of the hull had to be lined with fuel cells, which could be easily breached by armor-piercing rounds. Another major drawback of the T-34 was the lack of a radio on each tank. Only the tanks of a platoon leader were equipped with a radio. Communication between tanks was intended to be done using flags, an absurd proposition in the heat of tank combat. While German tanks coordinated via radio, Soviet tankers were expected to wave flags at each other to coordinate their movements, especially with the T-34's notoriously low visibility. As a result, despite the T-34's capabilities, Soviet tankers were frequently outfought by the Germans. The most serious vulnerability of the T-34, however, was its poor workmanship. Random tests of newly completed T-34s in 1942 showed that only 7% were free of major defects. In 1943, random T-34s were taken directly from the production lines and subjected to a 300 km reliability trial, with less than 8% completing the trial without breaking down. Soviet tank brigades were known to experience losses of 30% to 50% of their tanks in transit before even seeing enemy action. The average T-34 lasted less than 124 miles, 200 kilometers, before needing major repairs or overhauls. A T-34 could barely get through its first full tank of diesel before needing repair. With all these vulnerabilities, it's difficult to consider the T-34 the best tank of World War II, but it's important to remember that many of the T-34's defects stemmed from the poor workmanship of a hastily assembled workforce of unskilled peasants. The Soviets were desperate, with their backs against the wall, and it showed in the numerous defects built into the T-34. Despite the fact that the core design on paper was always sound, its tactical limitations and vulnerabilities were quickly addressed, with fixes implemented into new models. However, one of the key qualities that makes the T-34 the best tank of World War II was the ease with which it could be produced. The Soviets produced over 30,000 T-34s between 1941 and 1943, compared to just over 5,000 German Panzer IVs. The T-34 was truly great because, while not the best engineered design, it was a very strong design that could be built quickly and inexpensively, even with a very inexperienced and low-quality workforce, proving to be a critical advantage over the German Tiger and Panzer tanks. What do you think was truly the best tank of World War II? Why or why not? Let us know in the comments, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more great content.